March 17, 2026, 04:23 a.m. Eastern Europe. Radar stations in Poland light up red. Unknown aircraft are crossing the border from Belarus. Seconds later, explosions ripple through Suwałki, the narrow corridor connecting Poland to Lithuania. Communications with several forward units go dead. In Moscow, a statement airs on every channel. To protect Russian citizens in Kaliningrad and Belarus, a limited peacekeeping operation has begun. By sunrise, NATO command is on full alert. Fighter jets scramble from Germany, Britain, and the Baltic states. Roads in Warsaw clog with evacuations. The war no one believed could happen in Europe has begun. At 04x hours, Polish radar near Augusta picked up the first signs. Low-flying aircraft with transponders off, moving west from Belarus. Moments later, artillery fire echoed across the border. Within minutes, the Suwałki corridor, a 65-kilometer strip linking Poland and Lithuania, became the most dangerous place on Earth. The Russians called it Operation Shield of the West. The West called it an invasion. Belarusian mechanized divisions crossed under Russian command, cutting the highway that connected NATO's Baltic forces to the rest of Europe. At 04:27, drones struck a Polish border post. By 05 EU, Russian paratroopers were landing near Suwałki and Szczecin, securing a bridgehead that split NATO's eastern flank in half. In Warsaw, the Prime Minister addressed the nation live. "Our country is under attack. This is not an exercise. This is war." Within the hour, martial law was declared. Sirens blared across cities and citizens flooded metro stations turned into shelters. The Polish Air Force scrambled its remaining F-16s from Poznan and Łask, heading east to engage the advancing columns. But the Russians were prepared. Electronic warfare units jammed GPS signals across the entire region. Mobile networks collapsed. Fighter jets were flying blind, guided only by radio triangulation and visual sighting. Satellite imagery from U.S. Space Command showed hundreds of armored vehicles crossing the border in tight formations, covered by electronic umbrellas that made targeting almost impossible. By dawn, Russian troops had surrounded the Polish town of Suwałki. Local defense brigades fought block by block, buying time for NATO to respond. Western media called it the new Stalingrad in reverse. At 7:15 a.m., a NATO emergency session convened in Brussels. The debate was brief, too brief. Article 5 was invoked provisionally. The alliance agreed to deploy air and missile forces to protect Poland and the Baltic states, but avoided calling it war. Diplomats used the phrase collective defense in progress. In the skies over the Baltic, U.S. F-35s from Spangdahlem joined British Typhoons in intercepting Russian bombers approaching Gdańsk Bay. One of them, a Tu-22M, veered too close. Two AIM-120 missiles were fired. The bomber exploded mid-air, its wreckage falling into the sea. That was the first confirmed kill of the war. By mid-morning, columns of NATO armor rolled east from Poznan. German Leopard 2A7s and American Bradleys formed a new defensive line stretching from Białystok to Olsztyn. They were met by Russian T-90Ms advancing under a screen of drones. The first major tank battle on European soil since 1945 had begun. The Kremlin's narrative unfolded in parallel. Russian state TV declared the operation a preventive strike to secure Kaliningrad from NATO encirclement. Images of destroyed vehicles were broadcast with captions claiming they were Western mercenaries. But satellite photos told a different story. Entire Polish mechanized brigades overrun in Suwałki. Russian forces consolidating in Augusta. Belarusian artillery shelling Lithuanian towns across the border. NATO analysts realized what was happening. This wasn't about Kaliningrad. It was a corridor campaign. A lightning war to isolate the Baltics before the alliance could fully react. By noon, cyber attacks paralyzed financial networks in Poland and the Baltic states. Train schedules vanished. Government websites went black. A deep-fake video of the Polish president announcing surrender circulated on social media, viewed over 20 million times before it was debunked. In Warsaw, the mood shifted from shock to grim determination. Polish reservists lined up at recruitment centers. Old World War II bunkers were reopened and stocked. The president of Poland, visibly exhausted, spoke again before cameras. "We have been here before. We know what occupation looks like. We will not see it again." At 15 local time, U.S. Strategic Command upgraded its posture to DEFCON 3. American bombers lifted from Lakenheath, refueled over the North Sea, and circled near Estonia. A signal, not yet a strike. But over Kaliningrad, the Russian flag now flew unchallenged. The corridor was closed. And in Brussels, the NATO Secretary General's words sounded less like reassurance and more like prophecy. "If we lose Suwałki, we lose the Baltics. If we lose the Baltics, we lose Europe." Disclaimer: this is a fictional geopolitical simulation. It does not depict or predict real events. It explores how a regional military incident could spiral into a full-scale European conflict. The second day of the war began under a sky the color of steel. NATO reconnaissance drones circled the Polish coastline as smoke rose from the port of Gdańsk. Russian cruise missiles had struck the shipyards, igniting oil depots and destroying several cargo terminals. The Baltic Sea, once a highway of trade, had become a front line. Satellite footage released by U.S. European Command told the story in silence. Columns of Russian armor advancing west from Kaliningrad, artillery positions dug along the Prigolya River, and a swarm of drones sweeping south toward Poland. Each movement looked methodical, rehearsed. The speed suggested planning, not weeks but months in advance. At 08:12 a.m., the first missile struck Gdańsk proper. The blast shattered glass across 5 districts. Civilians ran for the metro tunnels as the city's emergency sirens howled. Within an hour, Poland declared Gdańsk a defensive fortress. Its mission: delay the Russian advance at any cost. The commander of the Northern Defense Line, General Tomasz Nowak, described it bluntly to his staff. "We are the wall. If Gdańsk falls, the sea is theirs." Behind that wall, NATO logistics shifted into overdrive. Convoys from Germany and Denmark poured across the Oder River, carrying anti-tank missiles, air defense systems, and fuel. British Typhoons landed at Wask Air Base, while American F-35s began round-the-clock sorties from Lakenheath. In the skies above Poland, contrails formed a white web, the shape of the alliance waking up. By afternoon, the first counterstrike began. 2 U.S. destroyers in the Baltic launched Tomahawk missiles toward Russian positions near Baltic. Explosions rippled across the Kaliningrad coast, striking radar installations and air defense batteries. The message was clear: NATO was no longer observing. But Russia had anticipated the move. Minutes later, mobile S-400 systems hidden in the forests east of Kaliningrad fired back. One missile found its mark, slamming into the USS Gravely. The ship remained afloat, but 30 sailors were killed, the first American casualties of the war. In Washington, the news arrived as the president met with the Joint Chiefs. The Secretary of Defense's voice was low. "They just killed Americans, sir." "Then this just became our war," the president replied. By dusk, the Polish 16th Mechanized Division engaged Russian armor along the Elbląg line. It was a brutal close-range battle fought in snow and mud, Leopard 2A7s against T-90Ms. Drones hovered above like vultures, guiding artillery fire from both sides. The air trembled with the sound of shells. Every kilometer cost dozens of lives. In the nearby port of Gdynia, the remnants of the Polish Navy fired Harpoon missiles at Kaliningrad's coastal defenses. One found a target, a Russian corvette, sinking it in the shallow waters of the Bay of Gdańsk. The city erupted in cautious celebration. For a moment, the world saw hope. But that hope didn't last. At 22:46, Kaliningrad's long-range artillery opened fire. Dozens of 203mm shells rained down on Gdańsk. The first struck a hospital, then a residential block. The third hit a NATO field command post. Communications went down. Power grids failed. And in the orange glow of burning cranes, the defenders understood. The siege had begun. Internationally, panic deepened. Germany closed its eastern border to refugees. Sweden activated its wartime readiness plan for the first time since 1943. Finland, freshly admitted to NATO, requested U.S. air defense deployments to its southern coast. The Baltic Sea now hosted 4 navies pointing guns at one another, each waiting for a mistake. In Moscow, the Kremlin framed it as success. Kaliningrad is secure. NATO aggression has been contained. The operation will end soon. But inside the Russian Defense Ministry, intercepted communications told another story. Their advance had stalled. Logistics convoys from Belarus were being bombed. Ammunition was running low. The cost of holding the corridor was bleeding the army dry. At 03 a.m., Polish Special Forces, GROM, launched a daring raid deep behind Russian lines near Braniewo. Their target, a mobile command vehicle coordinating strikes on Gdańsk. The operation lasted 19 minutes. The convoy was destroyed. Video of the burning wreckage spread across Western media before sunrise. It became the first major psychological victory for Poland. But victories were measured in hours. By morning, Russian bombers struck Warsaw's airport. Civil flights ended. NATO announced Operation Iron Shield, a full-scale deployment of U.S. and European forces into Poland. The alliance was now officially at war, though no one dared to use the word. In Brussels, as sirens wailed outside the NATO headquarters, the Secretary General delivered a single line that would echo for decades. This began as a border skirmish. Now we are fighting for the survival of Europe itself. The third week of the war began not with an explosion, but with a silence that frightened every commander. After days of artillery and airstrikes, the guns fell quiet along the Elbląg front. Satellite imagery showed Russian units digging deeper defensive lines, pulling armor back toward Kaliningrad. Analysts in Brussels recognized the pattern. Russia was preparing for a counterattack, or baiting NATO to launch first. At 05 hours, Operation Iron Shield began. Polish and German armored divisions moved east from Torun under cover of fog. Overhead, U.S. F-35s and British Typhoons cleared the airspace, striking radar stations and drone launch sites. On the ground, the goal was simple and impossible at once. Reopen the Suwałki corridor and cut the Russian link between Kaliningrad and Belarus. The first push came through the ruins of Elbląg. Streets once lined with cafes and markets became canyons of twisted steel. The Polish 20th Mechanized Brigade advanced house by house, marking progress in meters. German Leopard 2A7s rumbled behind, firing at thermal targets through smoke so thick that visibility dropped to 5 meters. Drones relayed images of burned-out T-90s and abandoned supply trucks, evidence that the Russian offensive had stalled but not yet broken. By noon, NATO air power dominated the skies. American bombers launched precision strikes on bridges across the Pergolia River, isolating Russian formations near Braniewo. The destruction was surgical yet brutal. Whole battalions were trapped without fuel. For the first time, Western analysts used the word momentum. Moscow reacted within hours. State television cut to a solemn broadcast from the Kremlin. The defense minister announced the activation of Russia's Strategic Deterrence Readiness Level 2. Translation: tactical nuclear units were moving into position. Footage showed Iskander launchers rolling through Kaliningrad's forests under camouflage nets. In Washington, the Situation Room lights dimmed as the president conferred with NATO allies. "If they load those warheads, we have to show resolve," said the Secretary of Defense. "Resolve doesn't mean suicide," replied the British Prime Minister on a video link. Silence followed, the kind that means every option left is terrible. At 14:30 GMT, NATO artillery opened fire. 1,000 shells screamed eastward, covering the advance toward the corridor. The ground shook from Białystok to Klaipėda. In the chaos, a Polish battalion captured a Russian command post outside Gdańsk. Inside were coded orders referencing Operation Sable Rain, a plan for limited nuclear strikes on battlefield targets if Kaliningrad was threatened. The documents reached Brussels within an hour. Panic rippled through every Allied capital. Was it a bluff? A contingency? No one knew. What they did know was that the word nuclear had left the shadows. By dusk, NATO forces reached the edge of the corridor. Columns of smoke rose from burning villages. Russian artillery answered with cluster munitions, forcing convoys to scatter. Refugees poured west, their cars covered in white cloths. A BBC crew broadcasting from the highway captured the moment a missile struck less than a kilometer away. The feed cut mid-sentence. The clip would later define the entire conflict. Then, at 21:12 local time, sensors at the U.S. European Command Center detected multiple launches from Kaliningrad, short-range ballistic missiles heading west. Sirens wailed from Gdańsk to Berlin. 5 minutes later, NATO radar confirmed interception by Patriot and Aegis systems. None of the warheads detonated. Whether they were dummies or misfires, no one could say. The President of the United States addressed the world an hour later from the White House bunker. We have no confirmation of nuclear use, but the risk is real. We will not answer darkness with darkness. Yet if a single nuclear weapon explodes on NATO soil, the response will be total. Across Europe, cities went black as power grids were taken offline to protect against EMP damage. Trains stopped, airliners diverted, families huddled by radios like it was 1942. The world was waiting for light or for fire. In Kaliningrad, Russian officers received new instructions. Hold positions, no launches without presidential authorization. In Warsaw, Polish troops raised their flag again over the Suwałki bridge. The corridor, shattered and smoking, was technically reopened. But victory had no meaning. Both sides now stared across a front line soaked in fuel, surrounded by warheads waiting for permission. And as night fell over the Baltic, the only message transmitted without interference was the one no one wanted to hear. A NATO-coded alert, repeated on every channel. Condition red, prepare for nuclear release authorization. Disclaimer. This narrative is a fictional simulation. It does not depict real events or promote any hostility. It illustrates how rapid escalation between nuclear powers could occur through miscommunication and fear, emphasizing the need for restraint and diplomacy. The 36th hour of the crisis began with a trembling silence. In the command bunkers beneath Brussels, Washington, and Moscow, the clocks were no longer synchronized. Satellite networks were fractured, cables burned, and commanders waited for orders that might already be obsolete. The only thing that still worked everywhere was fear. In Warsaw, the power grid flickered as NATO officers pored over intercepted Russian transmissions. One message stood out, garbled but clear enough. Authorization pending, prepare payloads. Analysts believed it referred to the Iskander units near Kaliningrad. Every minute without confirmation felt like a lifetime. At 06:04 local time, Polish radar picked up several unidentified contacts over the Baltic. Alarms screamed across the region. Within seconds, NATO command centers from Berlin to London went into condition red. Fighter jets scrambled, missile crews moved to firing stations, then nothing. The radar blips vanished. It was a false reflection from debris in the upper atmosphere. The war was one heartbeat away from starting itself. In Moscow, General Sokolov, commander of Western Military District, sat in a room buried beneath the Kremlin. A red phone glowed beside him, the direct line to the president. On his monitor, the Kaliningrad commander reported enemy movement near the perimeter. His finger hovered over a sealed code packet marked Emergency Level 1. But the line stayed silent. The president hadn't called. He waited. Meanwhile, in Brussels, the NATO Secretary General addressed the crisis room. If they launch, we retaliate, but we must not fire first. No mistakes. The phrase "no mistakes" echoed like a prayer. But outside those walls, mistakes were already happening. In the fog north of Gdańsk, a Russian artillery unit, cut off, out of communication, surrounded, opened fire on what they thought were NATO tanks. They hit a refugee convoy. Hundreds died. Within minutes, Western media broadcast the images live. Crowds in European capitals demanded vengeance. Hashtags called for nuclear retribution. In Washington, the president's advisors argued, "They've used chemical rounds," one shouted. "We don't have confirmation," another replied. "How long do you want to wait? Until Warsaw's gone?" The president slammed his fist on the table. "We will not be the ones to end the world by accident." At 09:42 GMT, a single missile rose from Kaliningrad's coast, bright against the morning haze. NATO radar operators froze. Trajectory, unknown. Range, short. Type, possibly Iskander-M. Orders were given to intercept. Within 2 minutes, a Patriot missile launched from Polish territory. The intercept succeeded, mid-air. But the impact triggered a blinding flash visible for hundreds of kilometers. The world held its breath. Sensors analyzed the plume. No nuclear signature. It had been a conventional warhead, perhaps even a misfire. But the damage was already done. Communication links between Moscow and Washington collapsed under the storm of conflicting alerts. The hotline went dead for 6 full minutes. In those 6 minutes, launch keys turned in 3 different bunkers. Submarines in the Barents Sea and North Atlantic rose to attack depth. Pilots received coded packets and refused to open them until verbal confirmation. It was the closest humankind had ever come to extinction without crossing the line. At U9:49 GMT, the hotline crackled back to life. An exhausted voice came through from the Russian side. Ceasefire proposal, immediate. The message was relayed to Brussels, then to Washington. Within minutes, all NATO operations froze. Fighter jets turned back. Artillery fell silent. On every frequency, one phrase repeated in English and Russian alike. Hold fire, hold fire, hold fire. Across Europe, people emerged from shelters expecting the sky to burn. Instead, they saw the first rays of daylight filtering through smoke. For the first time in days, the horizon wasn't on fire. Negotiations began 12 hours later in Geneva. No cameras, no applause, no handshakes, just trembling hands, signing an agreement neither side believed would last. But the war was over. In the days that followed, the world began counting the cost. Over 60,000 dead in Poland and the Baltics. Entire cities scarred. The Baltic Sea contaminated by oil and wreckage. Economies broken, alliances fractured. Yet the unthinkable hadn't happened. Not because of politics or strategy, but because, at the final moment, human beings on both sides hesitated. One NATO general summarized it quietly in a press briefing weeks later. We didn't win, we simply survived. And in Kaliningrad, under a gray sky still heavy with smoke, a Russian officer walked alone to the shore and looked out toward the west. He reached into his pocket, took out the unopened launch code packet, and threw it into the sea. The crisis had ended. Not with peace, but with exhaustion. And for the first time in a century, the world understood that survival itself was victory. Disclaimer: this story is a fictional simulation. It does not predict or depict real events. It explores how a chain of military and political miscalculations could bring nuclear powers to the edge of destruction, and how restraint might still save them.